We have a lot to talk about. Mark, thanks for joining me here. Thanks for having
us. Everyone.
Let's just dive right in, since time is of the essence. You're working on a new book. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about it.
It's going to be a new book. To me right now, it's an old book because I've been working on it for too long. But it's a book about how food and humans have interacted for the last 200,000 or 10,000 years, take your pick, and how food and the search for food and agriculture have affected civilization, how we've changed, how our populations have grown and migrated, and then in the last 120 years, how things have become so bad, not to put too fine a point on it, and how we find ourselves in this so-called food system where a third of the world eats as well as it wants to, a third of the world doesn't eat enough, and a third of the world eats some kind of weird combination of too much and not enough and gets sick as a result of that. So how did we get into that? What's it look like? And how do we get out of it? It's like a pamphlet, really.
So let's go to what everyone wants to know. How do we get out of it?
Well, that's obviously the hard part. And I think if you look at books that whose conceit is to analyze history and the way forward, no one knows. But we've heard, in the last 2 or 3 panels, people I really respect talk about how we get out of these things. And I think we get out of it a bit at a time, and we try things that we think will work, and we see how well they work, and then we try other things after that. And the problem is that now we're not trying a whole hell of a lot. So there aren't a lot of programs that say, how do we fix these things? But there's a bigger problem, which is that you can't fix food without fixing everything else. So we're talking about systems change. We're not talking about like making more nutritious food or turning junk food into something else, or meat substitutes, or all of those may be a part of the picture. But when land is being abused by farming and food is as cheap as it could ever possibly be, and there are still people who can't afford it, that doesn't mean the answer is to make food cheaper. It means the answer is to make food so people can afford it. So that's a really big change. To make good food that people can afford universally without abusing the land, that's not like tinkering at the edges. So I do think I'm kind of contradicting myself, because I do think we need to make small changes, but they need to be changes that move in the right direction. And we need to move in the direction of land reform, which is kind of a dirty word, but nevertheless, we need to be able to put land in the hands of people who want to farm it and want to respect the earth. And we need to, we're spending $100 billion a year on agricultural subsidies right now, and 99 billion of that, more than 99 billion of that, is going to produce the wrong kind of food, or not food at all, like ethanol. So if we took $100 billion and started to use it to subsidize good farming and good food, that would be a huge change. That would be something. It's not happening with the current administration, and that's not happening. You don't hear any candidates proposing anything that approaches that. So I think the more we can do to subsidize people who want to farm well, to subsidize efforts to make good food more accessible, more affordable to more people, I think we will see improvements in environment, improvements in public health, and so on. And that, I hope that would encourage people to go more in that direction. Not to put too fine a point on it, I'm a socialist. I think we need big time systems change. So this is a part of that. But I'm not an armed revolutionary, so I don't think that we can just make it happen. I used to think that, but it's a long time ago.
in the past, I don't know, 10 years, we've seen a lot of changes in the way consumers want to buy food. We've seen organic go mainstream. Antibiotics are a thing of the past in most chicken production. And yet, these seem like big changes, but then we're still so far away from where we actually want to be. So what, if anything, can individual consumers do to push things in the right direction when we're not seeing the policies we want enacted? Or have we maxed that out?
No, hardly. And, the two examples you gave are not policy examples. I mean, I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to be difficult,
but they're not policy.
Right.
There's something that happened because consumers demanded it. We haven't seen the policies that would require those kinds of changes.
Right, and as Marion, you were all here when Marion was speaking an hour ago, whenever it was, and as Marion said, what we need are policies, and also to quote Marion, who is my guru in some ways, organic junk food is still junk food. So I think consumers are looking for better food, but it's for the most part, it's not there. So you look for better food, and boom, you have Whole Foods, and what is Whole Food but a giant store filled with organic junk food? Not entirely filled with organic junk food. I will say that you could go shopping there and buy good food, but if you're the kind of person who thinks that organic shampoo is really important, then you found your holy grail. But we haven't really looked at. I'm just trying to remember what your second example was,
the chicken with the antibiotic.
Right. So the promise, Smithfield promised, when I was writing for the Times, and I left 5 years ago, so at least 5 years ago, and I think longer ago than that, Smithfield promised that it was going to take antibiotics out of their animal production by 2022. And McDonald's promises that they're going to have no chicken antibiotics by 2025, or whatever it is, and they show you that they're going to be doing this thing, but no one's following up on them. They don't really actually do it. They might cut back a little bit, but until there's a policy, and if the manufacturers really want to cut back on antibiotics, then they shouldn't fight this policy. If there's a policy that says no prophylactic antibiotics for use in food, then you can't do it anymore. And you're breaking the law after that. And it can be enforced. But if you rely on voluntary, this is on the Obama administration, by the way. If you rely on voluntary withholding of antibiotics, well, that's like me saying, the next time I get a cold that seems to be going on too long, I swear I'm not going to take antibiotics. But then when I get it, I call my doctor and say, can I have antibiotics? They're going to use them. So unless there's a law that says you can't use them, they're going to use them. This is about policy, and we don't have effective policy.
I agree, 100%. Policy needs to be what is the main driving force here, but policy comes from politicians, and the politicians aren't talking about, politicians are definitely not talking about mandatory antibiotics.
No, they are talking about, they do have programs that the Democrats, a couple of them, a few of them actually are talking about agriculture for the first time. 4 years ago, I went with some colleagues to Iowa to talk about food and farming with presidential candidates, and none of them would talk to us. It was just a joke. Now, at least, they're talking about it. But your question, to get back to it, your question was, what do consumers do? That was your question.
It is, but when I say consumers, I don't just mean people with dollars. I mean people, because we're all consumers.
Well, we're all eaters. It's probably a better definition than consumers. We've been turned into consumers.
We're all, what can humans do? We're in a sense, I think there's a sense of crisis right now, and there's finally a recognition that in order to slow down this climate apocalypse that's coming at us at full speed, we need to change food. And it's exciting to see that recognition finally, become mainstream. But there's also a sense of, well, okay, now what? The politicians aren't doing it. And like you said, okay, so the antibiotics aren't in the chicken anymore, but they're still in the pork and they're still in the beef. And there's still way too much beef, and we could go on and on. So what can we as humans do right now? What do we do tomorrow? What do we do?
Could be interviewing you. It would be just the same conversation. It's funny to have a 20-minute conversation, because this is a 2-hour conversation, and I know you're all, I guess we shouldn't go into the logistics, you're all tired and you've heard a zillion people and your heads are probably exploding, but we're talking in sound bites and in shortcuts in a way, because these are long and complex topics. But here's what we know. We know that agriculture is a big contributor to climate change, and we know that agriculture is a big contributor to how we eat, and we know that how we eat is driving what is now the leading cause of disease. Many of you may not know that sometime in the last 50 years, the number of annual deaths in the world from infectious disease became fewer than the number of annual deaths in the world from chronic disease. I mean, 500 million people in history have died from smallpox. That's more than like everything else combined, all wars combined. Smallpox doesn't exist. No one's died from smallpox in something like 40 years. So that was a public health victory, obviously, and now the public health issue is, how do we stop chronic disease? And the way we stop or reduce chronic disease, you're never going to stop it, is by improving diet. So you have agriculture driving climate change, and agriculture driving bad diet, and bad diet to some extent driving, not insignificant extent, driving deaths. So to me, agriculture is really at the foundation of this. How do we farm? What do we farm? How do we allow this food to be processed and marketed? All turns into what people eat. To change that, someone just said this, probably Karen Washington, to change that is a political act. I mean, eating is a political act. So if you want to eat well, you need policy that enables you to eat well and enables all of us to eat well. That doesn't mean that people with money can't eat well, and of course they can. And it doesn't even mean that people with money and even people without a lot of money can't improve their own health and can't have an impact on the way food is grown and even on climate change. But compared to what policy does, that is small beans, as we used to say.
So several years ago, I was interviewing Eric Schlosser, the author of Fast Food Nation, and I asked him, what do you think will fix everything? And his policy idea to fix food was to raise the minimum wage. What do you think of that? Well,
there's no one thing that works. Raising the minimum wage works. But raising the minimum wage means that food becomes more expensive. So there is I wouldn't call it a spiral, but it is more complicated. I think the minimum wage should be raised in any case. I mean, of course the minimum wage should be raised. It's way too low, and there are way too many people without enough money. But it's sort of like saying, well, to fix climate change, make public transportation free. Yes, well, that's part of the issue, but it does go a little deeper than that. You can't you can't give simple answers to this stuff. I would say the most interesting, if I could do that and one thing would change, and it was a sort of thing that wasn't end industrial agriculture, let's say it was within the realm of
reality,
sort of, I would end the ethanol mandate, because we're using the best farmland in the world to grow a fuel that's not even particularly efficient. And we're subsidizing it. So, I mean, is that a food question? I guess it's a food question, but it's an agriculture question, and it's I missed part of the talk, but I'm sure that in the last 2 hours, people have talked about land distribution and how it's been in the United States and elsewhere, but the United States is a big enough topic for us. Land has been distributed inequitably. That should be fixed. So if we take some land out of useless production, and there's plenty of land out of useless production, and we figure out a way to give it to people who want to farm and who want to steward the earth and who want to produce good food, that's a big, that's a huge change. That addresses minimum wages, that addresses racism, that addresses fairness and equality, it addresses affordability of food and nutritious food, and it gets rid of all of this stupid, 23 million acres of corn or whatever it is that's being grown in this country.
So we've had here today a number of very large companies that say they're working on sustainability, Mondelez, PepsiCo, smaller companies like Blue Apron. Do you see these companies as being facilitators of worthwhile change, or do you think that we should really just be burning everything down and starting from scratch?
Well, if you're giving me an either or.
I wanted to play Would You Rather, but
I think there's a big difference between a company like Pepsi, which doesn't really make anything good. So I don't know how you turn that into a company that makes good things. And same, how do you turn McDonald's around? I talked to some McDonald's board members about 10 years ago, and literally 10 years ago, not last month. And I said, if you guys want to justify your existence, other than we make a lot of money, if that's your justification, we make a lot of money, then you're great. I can't argue with you. This is America. But if you want to say, well, we're trying to do the right thing and we want to serve healthier food and you got to show up. And they're like, well, it's a very big company. It takes a long time. This is exactly what the guy said.
They still
the line. It takes a long time to turn the steamship around. Yeah. Well, screw that. What? So should those companies exist? Give me a magic wand. They won't. I don't think they should. But can larger scale companies have some role in doing some good? Sure, but we haven't really seen much of that.
That was going to be my next question.
No, we haven't.
Seen it?
We have Unilever especially. I don't mean to single them out because their rhetoric is so much better than anybody else's. Unilever talks a really great game about sustainability, and they admit that they're not perfect. And So, okay, that seems heartfelt and real, but it's not like things are particular. We can push them as hard as we want to push them, but. While I am generally in support, and we were going to talk about this and we're not, while I'm generally in support of meat substitutes, you can't tell me that Impossible Burger makes Burger King a good place to go to eat. It doesn't. That's the best point I'm making. So, how does Burger King become a good place to eat? How does that happen? Oh, we've just completely changed everything and now we're not Burger King anymore, we're Salad King? It's not happening. We're Rice and Beans King now. Have you tried the Impossible Whopper? I have tried the Impossible Whopper. I'm not going to comment on it right now because I was out the other day, I'm like, well, I tried the Impossible Burger at Impossible Burger, where I was invited a couple of years ago. But then the other day I was out on the road and I thought, I'm going to go have an Impossible Burger, Impossible Whopper. So I did. I went and had an Impossible Whopper and I ate some of it. And I texted, people work for me and with me in a variety of ways, but I'm allowed to, I guess it's fair to say I am some people's boss. So I said to some of the people who work for me, I want you to go have an Impossible Whopper. I don't want you to talk to anyone else about what you think of it. And then I want to have a conference call where we all reveal to each other. So I'm legally bound, I can't say. But because we're going to write about it on heatedmedium.com, we're going to write about it probably next week or the week after. But the bar is set. If you're comparing something to a Whopper, the bar is set very, very low. You're not eating a hamburger when you're eating a Whopper, you're eating a Whopper. It stinks to begin with. So this is as good as a Whopper is not,
It's
It's not a high bar.
Well, that's our perfect timing because we're out of time.
Should have been twice as long, but okay. Thank you.